Let us begin by commending ourselves to Our Lady's prayers. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou amongst women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death. Amen. So today's topic, ethics at the end of life. And we're all going to be there sometime, you know? I think in the past there was the idea that life has an absolute value and it deserves protection. But that idea has been replaced by the idea that life can be granted to us or taken away, and taken away for the sake of the greatest good of the greatest number. You know, that society can make those decisions for us. And that's the result of utilitarian philosophy. And that manipulation of nature has been helped by scientific developments in the fields of genetics and statistics and economics, which make the calculation of results much easier. During the 20th century, the idea of dying at God's appointed time has been replaced by human control of that process. Now, ironically, the father of modern genetics was an Augustinian monk. You've probably heard of him. He was called Gregor Johann Mendel, lived in the 19th century, 1822 to 1884. And he noticed in the monastery garden that certain plants did better than others. He was cultivating pea plants. You know, they wanted to have a good supply of peas in the monastery. So he saw that some plants did better. And so he began to pick out the good ones, what he thought were the good ones, and throw away those that weren't so good. Genetic engineering in a very, very small way. But he was, I'm sure farmers kind of knew this instinctively, but he was the first one who wrote it down. And then, in his lifetime, Charles Darwin wrote The Origin of the Species, and he included a chapter on the breeding of domestic animals. Again, the same idea. You know, that you get a runt in the litter, you know, a particular animal which is not very good. Well, you get rid of that, and you don't allow it to breed. But if you have a cow or a bull that's particularly strong, those are the ones you breed from. These ideas were much more fully developed by Darwin's cousin, the incredibly intelligent Sir Francis Galton. Now, he was born at the same time as Gregor Mendel, 1822, but lived till 1911. And he coined the word eugenics, which is, as it were, good breeding. And he described the theory and practice of improving the genetic quality of the human population. So you see how it's gone on. The pea plants, first of all, then animals in the farmyard, now the breeding of the human population. And he said there should be an improvement of human genetic traits through the promotion of higher reproduction of people with desired traits. Now that's what we call positive eugenics. So if any of you are, you know, great football players or, you know, very, very intelligent, you would be allowed to breed. But if you have negative traits, less desired, you would not be allowed to breed. That's what's called negative eugenics. Now, Galton devised a way of measuring human traits. He collected data and calculated statistics and drew conclusions. In his book, Hereditary Genius, 1869, he said that in the ideal society, the highly gifted would be enabled to achieve a first-class education, an entrance into professional life, while the weak could find a welcome and a refuge in celibate monasteries or sisterhoods. It's interesting, isn't it? In that English society where they didn't really approve of Catholic monasteries, they said, well, the weakest in society can go and live there. He believed that a scheme of marks for family merit should be defined, and able couples should be encouraged to have children by monetary incentives. So, you know, if you brought together two particularly healthy people or intelligent people, the government would give them money to encourage them to have several children. Now, eugenics, even at that time, was related to racism. In 1873, Galton wrote a letter to the Times newspaper of London to say that the industrious, order-loving Chinese should be encouraged to settle in Africa to supplant the inferior Negro race. So Galton had decided, Chinese, good people, hardworking, the black people in Africa, they, you know, gradually the Chinese should take over Africa. Then there was a magazine or a journal, a learned journal, the Eugenics Review, which was the journal of the Eugenics Education Society. That commenced publication in 1909, and there was the first International Congress of Eugenics held in July 1912, just after Galton's death. Because Galton's ideas, they were received sympathetically. Now, at this point, leadership in the field of eugenics passed to the United States. For some reason, I don't know why, there was an enthusiasm about eugenics here in the States. So, for example, physicians in Alabama called in 1910 for a state policy of eugenic sterilization, pointing out that such laws were already in action in Indiana, Connecticut, Utah, and California. So the states decided that certain people should not be allowed to reproduce. And by 1937, there were sterilization policies in 31 of the 48 states at that time. Now, at the same time, we begin to hear about Margaret Sanger. Now, she was the person behind Planned Parenthood, and she opened her first birth control clinic in the United States in 1916, receiving support from these eugenicists. In 1921, she founded the American Birth Control League, which later became the Planned Parenthood Federation of America. Sanger backed compulsory sterilization for what she called the retarded. And as with Galton, there was an element of racism in her ideas. You know, she said, not everyone should have the right to reproduce. And her book that she published in 1920 was called Woman and the New Race. You know, she wanted to have a kind of super race of superior people. And at that time, at the conference of eugenicists at that time, they said the right of the state to safeguard the character and integrity of the race or races on which its future depends is, to my mind, as incontestable as the right of the state to safeguard the health and morals of its people. As science has enlightened government in the prevention and spread of disease, it must also enlighten government in the prevention and spread and multiplication of worthless members of society, the spread of feeble-mindedness, of idiocy, and of all moral and intellectual as well as physical diseases. So you can see that the state or the government or whatever has a right to kind of control health. You know, vaccination programs or cleaning up sewers and that kind of thing so that disease doesn't spread. But now it's being applied to reproduction as well. And, you know, as a right of the state to prevent reproduction of what they call worthless people. Now, all this eugenics is the background of Hitler and the Jewish Holocaust. Margaret Sanger wrote, "We do not believe that community could or should send to the lethal chamber the defective progeny resulting from irresponsible and unintelligent breeding." But she did consider the idea. And, you know, it's kind of frightening that she uses that word, the lethal chamber, because, of course, that's what Hitler eventually developed, lethal chambers where people were taken and just put to death. There is a link between controlling the quality of the race by voluntary means, contraception, abortion, and involuntary means, that is, by the decision of the state, sterilization, abortion, euthanasia. Note that voluntary abortion in America has had a disproportionate effect on the black population. You know, Planned Parenthood has always put a lot of their facilities in traditionally Native American areas, African American areas, because kind of behind it there's a desire that these people should not be able to reproduce in large numbers. And then, of course, involuntary abortion was the policy in China for many, many years. You know, families were only allowed to have one child. At the Second International Congress for Studies on Population, held in 1935, it was held in Berlin, kind of a significant place. There were representatives from 36 countries, and one of the speakers, an American, described German eugenics laws as an outgrowth of earlier British and American ideas. This is what he said: "It is from a synthesis of the work of British and US eugenicists that the leader of the German nations, Adolf Hitler, ably supported by the Minister of the Interior, Dr. Frick, and guided by the nation's anthropologists, its eugenicists, and its social philosophers, has been able to construct a comprehensive racial policy of population development and improvement that promises to be epochal in racial history." So they're admiring Hitler because they say there's a racial policy, because Hitler already had this idea of creating a master race, this Aryan race. They said, what Hitler is doing sets the pattern which other nations and other racial groups must follow if they do not wish to fall behind in their racial quality, in their racial accomplishment, and in their prospects of survival. Now, what they were particularly admiring was that in 1933, Hitler had begun a program of trying to pick out the best people in German society and trying to get rid of those he didn't want. And in 1933, the first concentration camps were built. Now, they were generally for political prisoners, but in 1934, Heinrich Himmler took full control of the camps throughout Germany. And in 1939, Hitler enacted what was called the Action T4 program. And this was to put to death, this is what they said, incurably ill, physically or mentally disabled, emotionally distraught, and elderly people. So that was Hitler's program, to get rid of anyone who was a burden on the state. And of course, you know, Germany had entered into war by that time. So he was saying, we are not going to waste any money on anyone who is a burden on the state. Now, also under threat were all who were deemed inferior and threatening to the well-being of the Aryan race. You've got this idea, you know, the Aryan race, these kind of fair-haired, blue-eyed, strong people. Of course, Hitler himself was not really of, you know, that Aryan race. So the camp's facilities and personnel were used to purge German society of so-called racially undesirable elements. And these included Jews, any criminals, homosexuals, and also Romani people, you know, what we would call travelers or gypsies, but they prefer to be called Romani. And so those people were considered racially undesirable and could be put to death. Between 1939 and 1949 and 1945, during the war, as we know, the number of camps like that exploded to more than 300 concentration camps. And 6 million of the 9 million Jews of Europe were killed, and more than 4 million other people, including the handicapped. Hitler, at the beginning of the program, had posters put up all over the place saying, the handicapped are costing too much for society. So, you know, there's a poster showing a handicapped man, and the announcement with it goes, this man costs 60,000 Reichsmark because of his disease. He's causing all this cost to our community. And the poster says, fellow German, that is your money too. You know, the idea that society shouldn't be looking after people, but should get rid of them because they're too costly. Now, fortunately, the Catholic Church spoke up against this program. I mean, it wasn't a kind of widely announced program, but the Cardinal of Munster, Cardinal Clemens von Galen, preached and said in August 1941, he said this, for some months we have been hearing reports that on the orders of Berlin, patients from mental asylums who have been ill for a long time and may appear incurable are being compulsorily removed. Then, after a short time, the relatives are regularly informed that the corpse has been burned and the ashes can be delivered. There is a general suspicion verging on certainty that these numerous unexpected deaths of mentally ill people do not occur of themselves, but are deliberately brought about, that the doctrine is being followed according to which one may destroy so-called worthless life. That is, the policy to kill innocent people if one considers that their lives are of no further value for the nation and the state. So here's the idea: the individual is being sacrificed for the good of the majority, the good of the state. Now, the cardinal went on to say, we are dealing with human beings, our fellow human beings, our brothers and sisters, with poor people, sick people, if you like, unproductive people. But have they, for this reason, forfeited the right to life? Have you, have I, the right to live only so long as we are productive, so long as we are recognized by others as productive? If you establish and apply the principle that you can kill unproductive fellow human beings, then woe betide us all when we become old and frail. Woe betide the invalids who have used up, sacrificed, and lost their health and strength in the productive process. Woe betide loyal soldiers who return to the homeland seriously disabled, as cripples, as invalids. So he's saying, every one of these people, they're human beings. We cannot just do this. And saying, what about workers who've been working hard, in iron foundries or, producing products for the war effort? What if they are injured? Are you going to say, well, we're not going to look after you now? What about soldiers who've been injured? Are you going to say, oh, you've done your bit, now we can let you go? And of course, there were many soldiers who'd served in World War I, only sort of 20 years earlier, now in their 40s, but severely handicapped because of terrible wounds. Now the government was saying, you've done your bit, you can be put to death. Now, obviously, as at the end of the war, people discovered the extent of Hitler's final solution, they were horrified by it. And so with that, there was a rejection of eugenics and the classification of involuntary euthanasia as murder. So this idea that the state could put people to death, people sort of went away from that after the war. So the Euthanasia Society of America, which was formed in 1938, originally advocated for sterilization and involuntary euthanasia, but they had to change their tune. And so they said, oh, now we're only promoting voluntary euthanasia. For people who are sick and suffering, they can choose to bring their life to an end. So euthanasia, literally, the Greek words mean a good death. And that's come to refer to the intentional ending of a life in order to relieve pain and suffering. In the last 50 years, there's been considerable interest in voluntary euthanasia, understood as termination of life by a doctor at the request of a patient. And so now you get quite a lot of countries and quite a lot of our American states where voluntary euthanasia is legal. You got it in the Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg, Switzerland, Estonia, Albania, and in California, Colorado, Washington. Hawaii, Maine, Montana, New Jersey, New Mexico, Oregon, Vermont, and Washington State. So I don't know what it is about those northwest states. I mean, I know it rains a lot, but you know, it can't be so bad you want to bring your life to an end. So we can say this. In the context on the Catholic Church's teaching on the dignity of every human being, the Second Vatican Council already said all offenses against life itself, such as murder, genocide, abortion, euthanasia, and willful suicide, are against the moral law of the Church. In 1980, John Paul II released a specific document, a declaration on euthanasia, which gave more guidelines because, you know, things have been changing very, very quickly in that field. And it said this: the progress of medical science in recent years has brought to the fore new aspects of the question of euthanasia. And these aspects call for further elucidation on the ethical level. It is hoped that this declaration will meet with the approval of many people of goodwill who, philosophical or ideological differences notwithstanding, have nevertheless a lively awareness of the rights of the human person. So again, this is concerned with the rights of the human being. They said, intentionally causing one's own death or suicide is therefore equally as wrong as murder. Such an action on the part of a person is to be considered as a rejection of God's sovereignty and loving plan. Today, the word euthanasia is used in a more particular sense to mean mercy killing for the purpose of putting an end to extreme suffering or saving abnormal babies, the mentally ill, or the incurably sick from the prolongation, perhaps for many years, of a miserable life. But it's, you know, John Paul said, it is necessary to state firmly once more that nothing and no one can in any way permit killing of an innocent human being, whether a fetus or an embryo, an infant, or an adult, an old person, or one suffering from an incurable disease, or a person who is dying. Furthermore, no one is permitted to ask for this act of killing, either for himself or herself, or for another person entrusted to his or her care. Nor can he or she consent to it, either explicitly or implicitly. And he went on to say, you know, if people are suffering, doctors must do everything they can to prevent the suffering, not sort of take the easy way out of just ending that person's life. And he said, you know, the real response to this is a response of love, of care for the person, not to say, we cannot be bothered to care for them anymore. But he also dealt with, you know, when people are dying. And as I say, we're all going to be in that position. He says, however, is it necessary in all circumstances to have recourse to all possible remedies? In the past, moralists replied that one is never obliged to use extraordinary means. This reply, which as a principle still holds good, is perhaps less clear today by reason of the imprecision of the term and the rapid progress made in the treatment of sickness. Thus, some people prefer to speak of proportionate and disproportionate means. So here there is this very important distinction, you know, that if you're dying anyway, you know, you might die in a couple of months, you might die in a few days. You don't have to try every form of treatment because, you know, that treatment is really not going to help. And also, that treatment may be what they call burdensome. You know, it causes more pain, it causes more suffering. And again, this is John Paul. Therefore, one cannot impose on anyone the obligation to have recourse to a technique which is already in use, but which carries a risk or is burdensome. Such a refusal is not the equivalent of suicide. On the contrary, it should be considered as an acceptance of the human condition, or a wish to avoid the application of a medical procedure disproportionate to the results that can be expected, or a desire not to impose excessive expense on the family or the community. Now that's interesting because it says, you know, because we know sort of doctors, some doctors in Florida will say, oh, we can always try this and we can always try that. And it just goes on and on. And of course, you know, that's very good income for the hospitals. And every day you're in the hospital, you know, hospital is making more money and more money. But so John Paul himself says, don't go to all this expense, you know, because it's wasteful. We just have to accept our human condition. We are going to die at some point. And it's not necessary to go on and on. And of course, you know, these days people can be kept alive on a machine. Well, you don't have to do that either. He says this, when inevitable death is imminent, in spite of the means used, it is permitted in conscience to take the decision to refuse forms of treatment that would only secure a precarious and burdensome prolongation of life, so long as the normal care due to the sick person in similar cases is not interrupted. So you carry on the normal care. You know, if the person is able to take water, you know, you give them a drink of water. If they're able to eat, you give them something to eat. You know, you keep them clean. You give them oxygen so that they're not suffering in those last moments, but you don't have to go and give them another operation or something like that. Now, all of this, on the website now, there is, you know, there's me talking, you can see it, but there's also the text of all these talks. And so you can actually see all the references and the references to the catechism. And the catechism is very clear because, you know, written after this document on euthanasia and more discussion with doctors. And for example, the catechism says this, discontinuing medical procedures that are burdensome, dangerous, extraordinary, or disproportionate to the expected outcome can be legitimate. It is the refusal of overzealous treatment. Here one does not will to cause death. One's inability to impede it is merely accepted. The decision should be made by the patient if he is competent and able, or if not, by those legally entitled to act for the patient, whose reasonable will and legitimate interests must always be respected. And of course, this is the thing these days, that often the patient is not able to make these decisions. You know, you have someone who is responsible to making medical decisions for you. And it's important that they understand this. You know, people sometimes feel guilty, well, you know, and they'll say, well, the doctor says they could do this. You don't have to go on trying things if it's going to just make those last days absolutely miserable. You know, I have no family in country, so I have a Filipino nurse who is my, what do they call it, medical surrogate. She has to make the decisions. So I always say, I have to be nice to her because she's just going to, you know, put off the switch even at an early stage. But there's a difference between, you know, allowing death to come and choosing death. And so the Catechism is against assisted suicide, against people choosing to die. And as I say, this has become quite common. So this is what the Catechism says. Suicide contradicts the natural inclination of the human being to preserve and perpetuate his life. It is gravely contrary to the just love of self. It likewise offends love of neighbor, because it unjustly breaks the ties of solidarity with family, nation, and other human societies to which we continue to have obligations. Suicide is contrary to love for the living God. And, you know, it repeats the response when people is ill is to surround them with care and love, even, you know, to the very end. And, you know, if people choose suicide, you know, assisted suicide, as they can in some places, the family left behind, how do they feel? You know, they must feel that they failed in some way if that person has chosen to end their life. So for the Church, euthanasia can be distinguished from the stopping of extraordinary means of health care. The patient or guardian, in the case of an unconscious patient, has the right to reject outright or to discontinue those procedures which are extraordinary, do not offer a proportionate good, or do not offer a reasonable hope of benefit. Such a decision is most appropriate when death is clearly imminent. In these cases, the person would place himself in God's hands and prepare to leave this life while maintaining ordinary means of health care. So here's an example. A priest was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. And you know, pancreatic cancer is a terrible, terrible diagnosis. Rather than undergo painful chemotherapy or radiation, which would only give him perhaps 6 months more to live this life, he entered the hospice program, which provided nourishment, pain medication, and excellent nursing care. He prepared himself to meet the Lord. He had served as a priest for 45 years. So, you know, you can choose to let your life come to a natural end. You don't have to choose the extraordinary means which, you know, may cause greater suffering. Here's another example. Another younger man was dying of prostate cancer, which had metastasized throughout his body. In the hospital, he had gone into a coma and was being fed intravenously and was breathing through a respirator. His kidneys had failed. The doctors told the family that there was nothing more that they could do, and the situation was not reversible. At that point, the medical technology was not providing any hope of recovery or benefit, but was rather prolonging death. the family decided to turn off the respirator, which had now become an extraordinary means. And minutes later, he died. This action was morally permissible. It was not purposefully terminating life, but was allowing death to happen. You know, death was going to happen anyway. Now, the utilitarians, you know, that's the view, the very kind of balanced view of the Catholic Church. The utilitarians are always concerned, you know, to do what is best for the greatest number. So Peter Singer, the person we've sort of said representative of modern utilitarianism, says, with an irreversible condition causing protracted physical or mental suffering, the person can choose to end their life. But there is this difficult thing. Doctors have now linked euthanasia to the harvesting of organs for transplant. And that sends the cruel message to disabled or mentally ill people, your death has more value than your lives. So here you've got people who are not right, you know, they're not right up to the point of dying. They're suffering in some way, but doctors can persuade them to choose assisted suicide because they want to harvest their organs. In Oregon, not so long ago, 2 cancer patients were told that the Oregon Health Authority would not pay for their chemotherapy, but it would happily pay for their assisted suicide. So, you know, even if those people wanted treatment, they couldn't have it. They could only have the state help them to die, even if they weren't ready. So allowing euthanasia is a slippery slope. Any change in the law to allow assisted suicide or euthanasia would place pressure on vulnerable people to end their lives for fear of being a financial, emotional, or care burden upon others. Now, I bet some of you have taken parents into your own home to care for them at the end of their lives. And now, you know, if assisted suicide becomes common, people are going to say, oh no, I couldn't possibly, you know, put that onto you. And they're going to feel obliged to choose suicide. And then, of course, there is a different burden placed on the family, the burden of guilt. And if this choice was possible, it would especially affect people who are disabled, elderly, sick, or depressed. However, persistent requests for euthanasia are extremely rare if people are properly cared for. You know, people being looked after, whether it's in a home, you know, in their own home, or in an assisted living, they don't request suicide. I mean, it's extremely rare. If they're being looked after, they're happy to carry on with their life. So our priority as Catholics must be to ensure that good care, addressing people's physical, psychological, social, and spiritual needs, is accessible to all. There, it's time to finish. 12 o'clock, we've got a few minutes to get ready for Mass. As I say, the text of the talk is available on the parish website, and you can see a little bit more detail there and follow it. I know it's difficult to follow it all. The last talk next week is about the Catholic Church and healthcare in general, particularly all the work the Catholic Church has done to promote good medical care, good hospitals for so many years. Thanks very much.